Some muscle cars are instantly recognizable, sleek, beautiful, legendary from the moment they rolled off the line. But others? They were ridiculed, mocked, dismissed as ugly ducklings that insulted the very idea of American performance. Today, we're counting down 11 muscle cars that looked absolutely trash, but were engineering monsters under the skin. These are the cars that critics laughed at, that enthusiasts ignored, that seemed like jokes compared to their prettier siblings. But beneath the questionable styling, the awkward proportions, and the garish graphics lived serious engineering. Powerful engines, intelligent chassis tuning, performance capabilities that embarrassed cars that looked far better. These machines prove that you can't judge a muscle car by its sheet metal alone. From AMC's oddball creations to Ford's Malaise-era survivors, from Mopar's aerodynamic experiments to Pontiac's desperate badge engineering, these cars earned respect the hard way by performing when nobody expected them to. Let's dive into the metal and discover why the ugliest muscle cars sometimes had the biggest hearts. Number 11, 1974, Ford Mustang II, Cobra II. The Mustang II represents everything enthusiasts hated about the 1970s. Downsizing, emasculation, the death of performance in favor of fuel economy, and emissions compliance. Built on a modified Pinto platform, the Mustang II shrunk the legendary pony car into something that looked more economy hatchback than muscle machine. The styling was inoffensive at best, generic at worst, bearing almost no resemblance to the aggressive Mustangs that had defined the breed since 1964. The Cobra II package, introduced in 1976 but gaining traction in 77 and 78, slapped on graphics, spoilers, and aggressive styling cues that felt like putting racing stripes on a golf cart. The 302 cubic inch V8 produced a pathetic 140 to 150 horsepower, numbers that would have embarrassed any self-respecting muscle car just 5 years earlier. Critics savaged it. Enthusiasts mourned what Mustang had become. The automotive press treated it like a bad joke, a sad reminder of how far American performance had fallen. But here's what the critics missed. The Cobra II package wasn't just cosmetic. Ford engineers worked within severe constraints, emission regulations that strangled power, safety requirements that added weight, fuel economy standards that demanded efficiency, and created something surprisingly competent. The Mustang II's compact dimensions and relatively lightweight, under 3,000 pounds in many configurations, meant the modest power moved the car adequately. The suspension, derived from Pinto but heavily revised, delivered handling balance that earlier Mustangs never approached. The 4-speed manual transmission provided driver engagement that automatic-equipped competitors lacked. The Cobra II wasn't fast by muscle car standards, but it handled curves with composure and predictability. The steering was direct, the brakes were adequate, and the chassis balance rewarded skilled drivers. Road tests praised the handling even while lamenting the power deficit. On autocross courses and winding roads, the Cobra II embarrassed heavier, more powerful cars that couldn't negotiate corners without drama. The engineering achievement was making a performance car work within impossible constraints, creating something that delivered driving pleasure despite lacking traditional muscle car power. Today, the Mustang II remains unloved and undervalued, but the engineering that made it handle deserves recognition. It kept Mustang alive through the darkest years, maintained the nameplate until performance could return, and proved Ford hadn't forgotten how to engineer drivers' cars, even when regulations prevented building powerful ones. Number 10, 1970, AMC Gremlin X. American Motors Corporation's Gremlin looked like someone took a normal compact car and cut off the rear with a hacksaw. The chopped-off hatchback styling was polarizing when new and hasn't aged into acceptance. It still looks awkward, truncated, unfinished. The X package added graphics and trim that emphasized rather than minimized the odd proportions. The side stripes and bold lettering called attention to a shape that would have been better left understated. But AMC did something audacious with the Gremlin. They offered a 304 cubic inch V8 engine, producing 150 horsepower, stuffing serious displacement into a car weighing barely 2,500 pounds. The result was a power-to-weight ratio that delivered genuine muscle car acceleration in a package nobody expected. The Gremlin X with the V8 could run the quarter mile in the mid-15-second range, numbers that matched or beat many supposedly serious performance cars of the era. The straight-line performance embarrassed competitors. But the handling was the real surprise. The short wheelbase and compact dimensions made the Gremlin surprisingly agile. The weight distribution with a heavy V8 up front created understeer in inexperienced hands, but rewarded drivers who understood weight transfer and throttle steering. The suspension tuning was surprisingly competent, with spring rates and shock valving that controlled body motions better than the economy car origins suggested. The steering was direct and quick, providing feedback that made the Gremlin feel connected to the road in ways that larger muscle cars never achieved. The Gremlin became a favorite among drag racers who appreciated the lightweight body and available V8 power. The aftermarket developed parts and upgrades because the basic platform was sound despite the styling. Engine swaps were common. Racers discovered the Gremlin's engine bay could accommodate larger AMC V8s, and some even shoehorned in Chevrolet small blocks for maximum power. AMC's engineers had created a legitimate performance car, hampered only by unfortunate aesthetics. The build quality was typical AMC, adequate but not impressive, with interior materials that felt cheap and assembly that was merely acceptable. The dashboard was basic, the seats were thinly padded, and the trim pieces felt flimsy compared to Big 3 products. But the mechanicals were solid, the drivetrain was durable, and the performance was real. The 3-speed manual transmission that came standard was robust enough to handle the V8's torque, though serious performance buyers opted for the optional 4-speed. The Gremlin X proved that AMC could build muscle cars despite limited budgets and corporate resources. Today, Gremlins are collector curiosities, appreciated more for novelty than performance credentials. But the engineering that made them quick deserves respect, and the handful of survivors with V8 engines represent legitimate pieces of muscle car history, regardless of how they look. Number 9. 1971. Plymouth Roadrunner. The Roadrunner had been a muscle car icon since its 1968 introduction. Stripped down, affordable, powered by serious big block engines. The cartoon graphics and beep-beep horn added humor, but the performance was deadly serious. Then came the 1971 redesign, and Plymouth stylists seemingly forgot everything that made the Roadrunner visually appealing. The new body was longer, lower, heavier, and decidedly less aggressive than its predecessor. The styling was smoothed out, almost formal, losing the raw edge that had defined earlier Roadrunners. The proportions were off. The car looked heavy because it was heavy, gaining hundreds of pounds compared to earlier models. Critics panned the redesign, buyers stayed away, and sales collapsed compared to earlier years. But underneath the questionable styling lived genuine performance for buyers who ordered the right options. The 446-pack engine, introduced in 1969 and carried over into 71, produced 385 horsepower through triple 2-barrel carburetors. This engine transformed the heavy, ungainly body into a legitimate performance machine, capable of quarter-mile times in the low 14-second range at speeds approaching 100 miles per hour. The 6-pack setup used a center carburetor for normal driving and brought the outboard carburetors online under heavy throttle, creating a progressive power delivery that was tractable around town, but explosive at full throttle. The engine's torque, over 480 foot-pounds, overwhelmed rear tires with ease, creating tire smoke and drama that muscle car enthusiasts demanded. The suspension engineering adapted to the heavier body with revised spring rates and shock valving. The braking system used larger drums and optional front discs to control the increased mass. The result was a car that performed despite its weight, that honored Roadrunner's reputation even if the styling didn't. Plymouth built relatively few 71 Roadrunners with 6-pack engines because emissions regulations were tightening and insurance costs were climbing. The survivors are rare and valuable today, appreciated by collectors who understand that performance mattered more than styling, that underneath the unfortunate sheet, metal lived authentic Mopar muscle. Number 8. 1969. AMC Rebel Machine. AMC's attempt at a muscle car flagship resulted in one of the most visually controversial machines of the era. The Rebel Machine featured a white body with red, white, and blue graphics that looked like someone wrapped a mid-sized sedan in patriotic gift paper. The hood scoop was functional but cartoonishly large. The rear spoiler seemed tacked on as an afterthought. The overall effect was garish, loud, desperate, like AMC was trying too hard to compete with established muscle cars from Detroit's Big 3. The color scheme was mandatory initially. Every Rebel Machine came in white with the patriotic stripes, making subtlety impossible. and ensuring that owners either loved the attention or regretted their purchase immediately. Automotive journalists mocked it. Enthusiasts called it tacky. Buyers stayed away. AMC built only about 2,000 Rebel machines for 1970 before discontinuing the model. The poor sales weren't entirely about styling. The Rebel machine cost more than a comparable Plymouth Roadrunner or Chevrolet Chevelle SS, making it a tough sell when buyers could get established nameplates for less money. But the engineering underneath the unfortunate styling was legitimate and impressive, given AMC's limited resources. The 390 cubic inch V8, AMC's largest production engine, produced 340 horsepower and over 430 foot-pounds of torque. The engine breathed through a functional ram air hood scoop that fed cold air directly into the carburetor, improving power and throttle response. The carburetor was a 4-barrel motorcraft unit jetted specifically for the ram air system, optimized to take advantage of the pressurized intake charge. The 4-speed manual transmission connected to a 3.91 rear axle ratio that prioritized acceleration over top speed. The result was quarter-mile performance in the high 13-second range, at speeds approaching 104 miles per hour, numbers that embarrassed many supposedly superior muscle cars. The 60-foot times were particularly impressive, showing that the aggressive rear gearing and limited slip differential put power down effectively off the line. The suspension engineering was thoughtful. AMC tuned the springs, shocks, and anti-roll bars specifically for performance driving, creating handling that was composed and predictable despite the car's size and weight. The front suspension used heavy-duty components borrowed from AMC's larger Ambassador model, providing strength without excessive weight. The steering was quick for the era, providing better feedback than most midsize cars. The brakes used front discs and rear drums sized to handle aggressive driving. The Rebel machine also featured a twin-grip limited slip differential as standard equipment, improving traction and making the power more usable. The exhaust system used dual pipes with minimal restriction, creating a deep, aggressive exhaust note that announced the Rebel machine's presence long before it arrived. The interior was typical AMC, functional but plain, with materials that felt cheap compared to GM or Ford products. The bucket seats were supportive, but lacked the bolstering that aggressive driving demanded, and the door panels used hard plastic that felt brittle. The instrumentation was basic, with a speedometer and fuel gauge supplemented by minimal warning lights, rather than proper gauges for oil pressure and coolant temperature. But the mechanicals were solid, the engineering was sound, and the performance was real. The build quality, while not matching Big 3 standards, was adequate, and the cars proved durable in service. Today, the Rebel machine is remembered as an oddity, a curiosity, proof that AMC tried to compete in the muscle car wars, despite limited budgets. But the handful of survivors represent genuine engineering achievements, cars that performed far better than their styling suggested. The rarity works in their favor now. What limited sales in 1970 makes them valuable today, with clean examples commanding strong prices from collectors who appreciate their underdog status and legitimate performance credentials. Number 7. 1970 Dodge Super Bee with HEMI. The Super Bee had been Dodge's answer to Plymouth's Roadrunner, a stripped-down, affordable muscle car that prioritized performance over luxury. The 1970 model featured bumblebee graphics, thick stripes circling the tail that looked cartoonish and drew ridicule from enthusiasts who preferred subtler styling. The overall design was aggressive, but not particularly attractive, and the bumblebee stripes made it look almost juvenile. But for buyers who ordered the 426 HEMI engine, the styling became irrelevant because the performance was absolutely monstrous. The HEMI V8, legendary even when new, produced a rated 425 horsepower, though actual output was significantly higher. Dyno tests suggested over 500 horsepower in optimal conditions. The engine featured hemispherical combustion chambers that improved breathing and power at the cost of complexity and expense. The dual 4-barrel carburetors required careful tuning, and the engine demanded high-octane fuel and frequent maintenance, but the performance justified every complication. The Hemi Super Bee could run the quarter mile in the low 13-second range at speeds exceeding 110 miles per hour, performance that rivaled purpose-built drag cars. The torque was even more impressive than the horsepower, over 490 foot-pounds, delivered in a brutal rush that overwhelmed rear tires and created acceleration that felt more like controlled violence than transportation. The Super B's engineering extended beyond the engine. The chassis used heavy-duty components throughout, strengthened frame rails, upgraded suspension pieces, larger brakes, and a beefed-up differential that could survive the Hemi's torque. The transmission options included a 4-speed manual with a Hurst shifter or a torque flight automatic that could handle the power. Dodge built relatively few Hemi Super Bs because the engine was expensive and the insurance costs were astronomical. The combination of garish styling and extreme performance limited appeal. Buyers who could afford insurance and fuel often chose more subtle machines. Today, Hemi Super Bs are among the most valuable muscle cars, commanding six-figure prices at auction. The bumblebee stripes that once drew mockery are now considered iconic, proof that time changes perspectives and that performance ultimately matters more than styling controversies. Number 6, 1971. Ford Torino Cobra. The Torino nameplate carried Ford's intermediate muscle car aspirations through the early 70s, but the styling never achieved the iconic status of Mustangs or Chevys. The 1971 Torino Cobra was particularly controversial. The sports roof body looked bulky and generic, the front end was busy and cluttered, and the overall impression was of a car designed by committee rather than inspired by passion. Automotive journalists complained that it looked bland, that it lacked visual drama, that it seemed forgettable compared to its competitors. But underneath the uninspiring sheet metal lived serious engineering that made the Torino Cobra a legitimate performance machine and a NASCAR powerhouse. The 429 Cobra Jet V8, Ford's big block performance engine, produced a rated 370 horsepower though. Like most muscle car engines of the era, actual output exceeded the rating. The engine used a 4-barrel carburetor, aggressive camshaft timing, and high-flow cylinder heads to maximize power. The torque output exceeded 450 foot-pounds, providing brutal acceleration from a standstill. The Cobra Jet Torino could run the quarter mile in the mid-14-second range at speeds approaching 100 miles per hour. Respectable numbers for a car weighing nearly 4,000 pounds. The suspension engineering focused on NASCAR applications where Torinos dominated competition. Ford's engineers tuned the springs, shocks, and anti-roll bars for high-speed stability rather than autocross agility. The result was a car that felt planted and composed at triple-digit speeds, that could maintain racing speeds through long sweepers without drama. The weight distribution was carefully balanced to prevent the nose-heavy feel that plagued many big-block muscle cars, making the Torino surprisingly neutral in high-speed corners. The braking system used front discs and rear drums sized to handle repeated high-speed stops. The cooling system was upgraded to handle racing conditions. The aerodynamics, while not as dramatic as the Charger Daytona or Plymouth Superbird, were optimized to reduce drag and increase stability. The sports roof profile created a relatively clean airflow path over the car, and the recessed grille helped reduce frontal turbulence at high speeds. On NASCAR tracks, Torinos were virtually unbeatable in the early 70s, winning races and championships, while looking like the family sedan they were based on. The street Torino Cobras benefited from this racing development, receiving components and tuning developed in competition. Today, Torino Cobras remain relatively affordable compared to more famous muscle cars, but the engineering that made them NASCAR champions deserves recognition. They proved that racing success didn't require beautiful styling, that performance could exist in unglamorous packages. Number 5, 1970, AMC Hornet SC/360. The Hornet was AMC's compact economy car, designed to compete with Chevrolet Novas and Ford Mavericks, transportation for budget-conscious buyers who needed reliable, efficient vehicles. The styling was plain, almost aggressively boring, with none of the visual drama that characterized true muscle cars. AMC's stylists seemingly aimed for inoffensive anonymity, creating a car that blended into traffic without attracting any attention whatsoever. Then, AMC's performance division created the SC/360 package, stuffing a 360 cubic inch V8 into the Hornet's engine bay. and creating one of the era's most effective sleeper muscle cars. The engine produced 285 horsepower, modest by muscle car standards, but more than adequate in a car weighing barely 3,000 pounds. The power-to-weight ratio delivered genuine performance. The SC/360 could run the quarter mile in the low 15-second range, embarrassing cars that looked far more aggressive. The handling was surprisingly competent, thanks to the Hornet's compact dimensions and relatively balanced weight distribution. AMC's engineers included a handling package with the SC/360 that featured stiffer springs, larger anti-roll bars, and upgraded shocks. The result was a car that could navigate twisty roads with composure, that rewarded skilled drivers, that proved more capable than its economy car origins suggested. The braking system used front discs and rear drums that were adequate for the car's performance level. The steering was quick and provided decent feedback. The 4-speed manual transmission shifted positively and allowed drivers to extract maximum performance from the V8. The SC/360 package included subtle visual cues, a hood scoop that was actually functional, small graphics, and slightly wider tires. But the overall impression remained that of an economy car, which was exactly the point. The SC/360 could embarrass Camaros and Mustangs at stoplights, while looking completely innocent, the automotive equivalent of a sheep in wolf's clothing. AMC built limited numbers because the SC/360 was a niche product appealing to buyers who appreciated performance but didn't need flashy styling. Today, surviving SC360s are rare and increasingly collectible, as enthusiasts recognize their legitimate performance credentials and sleeper status. The engineering that made them quick despite mundane styling deserves recognition as proof that muscle cars came in all forms, that performance wasn't exclusive to cars with aggressive styling and legendary nameplates. Number 4, 1978 Dodge Aspen RT. By 1978, the muscle car era was officially dead, killed by emissions regulations, insurance costs, and fuel economy requirements. The Dodge Aspen represented Chrysler's attempt at a practical, efficient family car, a compact sedan and wagon designed for economy rather than excitement. The styling was boxy and generic, typical late 70s Detroit mediocrity. The build quality was atrocious. Aspen suffered from rust problems, electrical issues, and assembly defects that earned them terrible reputations. Consumer reports rated them among the worst cars available. Buyers complained constantly. Dodge's reputation suffered from the Aspen's failings, but buried in the Aspen lineup was the RT package, a desperate attempt to keep performance alive in the malaise era. The 360 cubic inch V8, detuned to meet emission standards, produced between 170 and 195 horsepower, depending on year and configuration. The numbers sound pathetic compared to muscle car glory days, but in the context of late 70s performance, they were almost respectable. The Aspen RT's relatively light weight, around 3,300 pounds, meant the modest power delivered adequate acceleration. Quarter-mile times in the high 16 to low 17-second range wouldn't have impressed anyone in 1970, but in 1978, they were competitive with anything available. The RT package included suspension upgrades, stiffer springs, larger anti-roll bars, upgraded shocks that improved handling beyond the base Aspen's wallowing mediocrity. The steering was quicker, the body roll was reduced, and the overall dynamics were tightened enough to provide some driving enjoyment. The brakes were upgraded to handle more aggressive driving. The 4-speed manual transmission, rare but available, provided driver engagement that automatic-equipped cars lacked. The visual package included graphics, spoilers, and trim that tried to make the boxy Aspen look aggressive, but mostly just emphasized how ungainly the basic shape was. The interior featured high-back bucket seats and instrumentation that attempted sporting character but couldn't overcome the cheap materials and poor assembly quality. The Aspen RT was a compromise, an attempt to build something resembling a muscle car, within constraints that made true performance impossible. But the engineering effort was real. Dodge's engineers worked within severe limitations to create something that performed better than its specifications suggested, that delivered some of the muscle car experience, even if it couldn't match the performance. Today, Aspen RTs are virtually extinct. The rust problems, poor build quality, and general indifference have sent most to junkyards. The handful that survive are curiosities rather than collector's items, interesting for what they represent rather than what they were. But they prove that even in the darkest years, Engineers tried to keep performance alive. That muscle car spirit survived, even when the performance didn't. Number 3, 1971. Chevrolet Chevelle, Heavy Chevy. General Motors' muscle car detuning was in full effect by 1971, as emissions regulations tightened and insurance costs climbed. Chevrolet's response included the Heavy Chevy package, a budget muscle car option that used graphics and trim to create performance imagery without the cost and insurance penalties of genuine big block engines. The Heavy Chevy featured stripes, badges, and cosmetic touches that looked cheap and desperate, like Chevrolet was trying to capture muscle car spirit with tape and decals rather than genuine engineering. Enthusiasts mocked it as posing, as marketing rather than muscle, as everything wrong with early 70s Detroit. The standard engine was a 350 cubic inch small block V8, producing 270 horsepower, respectable but not intimidating. But here's what the critics missed. The Heavy Chevy's engineering was more thoughtful than the cheap graphics suggested. Chevrolet's engineers included suspension upgrades with the package, F41 Sport suspension with stiffer springs and shocks, front and rear anti-roll bars, and performance-oriented geometry. The result was handling that embarrassed, many more expensive muscle cars that allowed the Heavy Chevy to navigate corners with composure and precision. The steering was quick and communicative. The braking system used front discs and larger rear drums. The rear axle featured Positraction limited slip that improved traction. The 350 engine, while not as powerful as earlier big blocks, produced strong torque, over 370 foot-pounds, that provided satisfying acceleration. The 4-speed manual transmission with Hurst shifter offered positive mechanical engagement. Quarter-mile times in the mid-15-second range weren't impressive compared to Hemi cars or LS6 Chevelles, but they were adequate and the handling was genuinely good. The Heavy Chevy proved that muscle car fun didn't require astronomical horsepower, that chassis dynamics and driver engagement mattered as much as straight-line speed. Chevrolet built limited numbers because buyers who wanted genuine muscle cars ordered more expensive packages, while buyers shopping on budget chose base models without the Heavy Chevy's graphics and upgrades. Today, Heavy Chevys are overlooked. Collectors prefer earlier, more powerful Chevelles with legendary engines and higher performance. But the engineering that made Heavy Chevys handle deserves recognition, and the surviving examples represent legitimate muscle car experiences, even if they weren't the fastest or most powerful. Number 2, 1970 AMC Matador Machine. AMC's full-size Matador sedan seemed an unlikely foundation for a muscle car. It was large, heavy, styled for practicality rather than aggression. The proportions were awkward, the styling was generic, and the overall impression was of a rental car rather than a performance machine. But AMC's engineers saw potential in the Matador's size and created the Machine package, stuffing a 401 cubic inch V8 into the engine bay and creating one of the era's strangest muscle cars. The engine produced 330 horsepower and over 430 foot-pounds of torque. Serious numbers, even in an era of big block excess. The Matador Machine could run the quarter mile in the low 14-second range, at speeds approaching 100 miles per hour, performance that matched or exceeded many supposedly superior muscle cars. The acceleration was brutal. The torque overwhelmed rear tires with ease, creating tire smoke and drama. The suspension engineering was thoughtful, despite the Matador's ungainly appearance. AMC included heavy-duty springs, upgraded shocks, and anti-roll bars, front and rear. The steering was power-assisted but retained reasonable feedback. The braking system used front discs and large rear drums. The 4-speed manual transmission shifted positively and allowed drivers to exploit the engine's power band. The Machine package included functional ram air induction that improved power and throttle response. The visual package featured graphics that emphasized rather than minimized the Matador's bulk, red, white, and blue stripes that looked garish and desperate. The interior was typical AMC, functional but cheap, with materials that felt low rent and assembly that was merely adequate. But the performance was real, and the engineering was sound. AMC built very limited numbers of Matador machines. The combination of odd styling, large size, and relatively high price-limited appeal. Today, survivors are extremely rare and increasingly valuable as collectors recognize their performance credentials and appreciate their oddball status. The Matador Machine proved that AMC could build legitimate muscle cars despite limited resources and questionable styling decisions. That performance could exist in unlikely packages, that engineering mattered more than sheet metal. Number 1. 1970 Dodge Charger Daytona. The Charger Daytona represents the pinnacle of looking trash, while being an absolute engineering monster. Dodge's aerodynamic experiment featured a pointed nose cone that extended 18 inches beyond the standard Charger grille, and a rear wing mounted on tall struts that stood nearly 2 feet above the trunk lid. The overall effect was cartoonish, outrageous, almost offensive, like someone had attached airplane parts to a muscle car as a joke. When the Daytona debuted in 1969 for the 70 racing season, reactions were mixed at best. Enthusiasts called it ugly. Critics mocked the wing. Dodge dealers struggled to sell them. Many removed the wings and nose cones to make the cars more palatable to buyers. The styling was so controversial that Dodge built only about 500 Daytonas to meet NASCAR homologation requirements, and then discontinued the model. But the engineering behind that controversial styling was absolutely revolutionary and made the Daytona one of the most important muscle cars ever built. The aerodynamic modifications weren't cosmetic. They were the result of extensive wind tunnel testing and computational analysis. The nose cone reduced frontal area and smoothed airflow over the car. The flush-mounted grille opening directed air through the radiator more efficiently. The smoothed-over headlight covers eliminated turbulence. The rear wing, positioned carefully through testing, generated downforce that improved stability at high speeds, while reducing drag compared to the standard Charger's flat trunk. The result was a car capable of exceeding 200 miles per hour on NASCAR superspeedways, the first stock car to break the 200-mile-per-hour barrier. The street versions, powered by either the 440 Magnum or 426 Hemi 5.8, weren't quite that fast, but they were still monstrously quick. The Hemi Daytona produced 425 rated horsepower, though actual output exceeded 500 horses. The quarter-mile performance was in the low 13-second range, at speeds exceeding 115 miles per hour. The top speed, limited by gearing and horsepower, approached 140 miles per hour. But the Daytona's engineering excellence extended beyond straight-line speed. The aerodynamic improvements made the car remarkably stable at high speeds, where standard Chargers became nervous and difficult to control. Above 120 miles per hour, the Daytona remained composed and predictable. The downforce from the rear wing improved traction and allowed higher cornering speeds. The reduced drag improved fuel economy at sustained high speeds. On NASCAR tracks, Daytonas were virtually unbeatable in 1969 and early 70, winning races by huge margins and forcing competitors to develop their own aerodynamic packages. Today, the Charger Daytona is recognized as one of the most important muscle cars ever built, and one of the most valuable, pristine Hemi examples commands 7-figure prices at auction. The wing and nose cone that once drew mockery are now iconic, recognized instantly even by people who know nothing about cars. The Daytona proved that engineering vision could overcome styling controversies, that performance justified aesthetic risks, that the pursuit of speed created beauty through function rather than form. The legacy extends beyond the car itself. The aerodynamic lessons learned building Daytonas influenced NASCAR and road car design for decades, proving that going fast sometimes means looking weird. These machines weren't just metal and fiberglass. They were proof that engineering excellence can exist in unfortunate packages, that performance doesn't require beautiful styling, that muscle car spirit survived even in the darkest years when regulations and economics seemed determined to kill it. From AMC's oddball creations that proved innovation wasn't exclusive to the Big Three, to Mopar's aerodynamic experiments that looked like cartoons but broke speed records, to Ford's Malaise-era survivors that kept performance alive when everyone else had given up, these cars earned respect through capability rather than appearance. Which of these ugly monsters deserves more recognition? Which one would you defend despite its styling? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you love stories about the cars that proved performance matters more than beauty, hit subscribe for more deep dives into muscle car history that goes beyond the obvious legends to celebrate the weird, the ugly, and the underappreciated machines that made American automotive history.